All right, turning to page 382, you have a section there on page 382 and 383 about Winston Churchill. Make sure you read that thoroughly. Churchill was a very interesting guy, very courageous. He stood up at a time when most Brits and most other Europeans refused to accept that another war was coming, and he stood up against them. So highlight the very first thing in that box. Winston Churchill was perhaps the 20th century's greatest statesman. You want to remember that about him. And in addition to being a great statesman, he was a very, very gifted speaker, uniquely eloquent. I mentioned that speech that he gave, This Is Their Finest Hour speech. And the words that he used and the way that he was able to wield them was just, it was something else. So look at the speech that he made on page 382 below your box there. He made a speech expressing gratitude to the RAF, and he said this: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." And just another example of his eloquence there. And he was exactly right, as was typical. And the British people, and really the entire rest of the world, owe a huge, huge debt of gratitude to these men. Many of them would go even days without proper sleep or even proper food, staying in the skies. If the plane was damaged, they'd land it, they'd jump right back in a new plane. They fought injured, they fought exhausted, and they were able to overcome against incredible odds. So now Operation Sea Lion is postponed indefinitely. Let's see what came next. Page 382, highlight the war in the Atlantic. Highlight that the goal was to strangle Great Britain's supply lines and cut her ties with her empire by establishing a submarine blockade. Remember, Great Britain is an island nation, and she had widespread colonies all around the world, and she depended on those colonies for a lot of even food, raw materials to keep her war production going. So Germany was determined to cut that off. Highlight that term, pocket battleships. And these were warships designed to meet the size limitations imposed on Germany's navy by the Treaty of Versailles. During the course of the war, the British Navy would sink many of the German surface vessels, but it was the German subs that were really winning the war in the Atlantic. And that would proceed for most of the war, and we'll talk about later how that problem was overcome. Let's look at war in the Mediterranean. Highlight Italian failures. Remember, the Italians were the weak link in the Axis powers, and they had many failures throughout the war, to their detriment, to the aid of the Allies. Highlight summer and fall of 1940. Highlight Greece, Egypt, and Suez Canal. So find those words. They tried to invade Greece. They failed. The Germans ultimately took Greece. They tried to invade Egypt to get the Suez Canal, but they also failed there. In North Africa, Mussolini's forces were completely routed by the British. In the meantime, planes launched from British aircraft carriers were attacking the Italian fleets in the Mediterranean, not helping them out at all there. So let's see what happened with the German intervention. Hitler had to bail out his ally here, did not make him very happy. Highlight the Afrika Korps. This was the name of the army group that Germany sent to North Africa. Highlight this guy's name, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Highlight his nickname, he was known as the Desert Fox. Perhaps one of Germany's most brilliant field marshals or generals of the entire war. He conquered all of the territory that was lost by the Italians and began to menace Egypt again. Highlight April 1941. Highlight Blitzkrieg in Yugoslavia and Greece. It took just weeks for both nations to fall. Highlight now invasion of Russia. The invasion of Russia. So remember that the Soviets and the Nazis had signed a non-aggression pact, and of course that had the secret clause that they could divide Poland between them. But in spite of that, Hitler had absolutely no intentions of keeping his word. In fact, Churchill had warned Stalin about this. Stalin refused to believe it. And highlight that Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. He wanted to add the largest nation on earth to his prizes. The Russians had engaged in war with Finland in what was called the Winter War. This convinced Hitler that the Russian armies were no match for his own Nazi stormtroopers. The Finns fought very, very hard, and the Russians had slow progress there. So Hitler looked at this and he said, "This is going to be easy. We are going to take the Russians down." After gaining the support of highlight the Finns and Romanians, Hungarians, and Bulgarians. These guys all wanted to regain territory lost in the First World War. Highlight that Hitler massed almost 3 million soldiers. And highlight the date of invasion, June 22nd, 1941. And Hitler called this operation Operation Barbarossa. There were some initial successes. They had achieved almost complete surprise. Like I said, Stalin had refused to believe Hitler was going to attack. He thought that non-aggression pact was going to protect it, and it did not. Highlight that Hitler's tanks pressed toward Leningrad, or highlight also St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Stalingrad. And really, at this point, the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed almost inevitable. But highlight this, the Russians had 2 great allies. Highlight that they called these allies General Mudd and General Winter. Hitler had actually set back his invasion plan of Russia by 6 weeks. Now, you might remember from reading about Napoleon that Napoleon had also attacked Russia. He also started his Russian attack in June. Both he and Hitler believed that they could take Russia before winter. Both he and Hitler proved to be very, very wrong. Hitler probably should have learned his lesson from Napoleon. He did not. So let's see what happened. Turning the page to 284. The mud from the rains turned the roads into quagmires. So those big, heavy, impressive German tanks found themselves foundering in the mud. By late October, the temperature had begun to drop. Now, Hitler's troops were still wearing their summer uniforms from June. They were completely unprepared, no winter clothing. They got, their biggest mistake probably was that they were invading so quickly that they got ahead of their supply lines. So the food, the gasoline tankers, all of that were miles and miles behind them. So the men were starving, they didn't have winter clothing, tanks were being left behind because they didn't have fuel. It was just a huge, huge mess for the Germans. So highlight Russia strikes back, and highlight winter of 1941 to 1942. It was at this point that the Germans seemed on the verge of collapse. When spring arrived, both Nazis and Soviets were exhausted, but the Russians had vast reserves of manpower that the Germans just didn't have. And they had the vastness of their land to use against them as well. So highlight those italicized words on the top of the second column there. The turning point of the war in Europe proved to be in 1941. With Operation Barbarossa, that invasion into the Soviet Union, Hitler had finally bitten off much more than he could chew. The Germans were experiencing losses in Russia, they had the stalemate with Great Britain, and at the end of the war, end of the year rather, they had the United States entry into the war. So the days of Hitler's supposed 1,000-year Reich were now very much numbered. Highlight this, the Allies, especially the United States, sent billions of dollars worth of weapons and other supplies to the Soviet Union during the course of the war. They considered Stalin and the communists to be equal partners against Hitler. So they were willing to send all of this money and supplies in aid against them. Unfortunately, a lot of that stuff would end up being turned against them in the Cold War, not in the form of actual war, thankfully. But we'll talk about the Cold War at a later date. So that is all the highlights for today. Make sure you answer all of your questions and complete all of your reading. Have a great rest of your day.